Hello and welcome to Paul's Faith. It's nice to be with you. Let me get everything set up here. Great, good. Welcome to Pause for Faith. I want to think about St Dominic today and just to think about his life, to tell his story. Because as some of you know, if you've been watching recently, I've been wanting to speak about different spiritualities. So I've spoken about Carthusian spirituality, Franciscan spirituality, to speak about Dominican spirituality in the next video. But just to stay, first of all, with the life of St Dominic, just to get to know him as a person, his mission, his ministry. And then in a second video to go a bit, I was going to say a bit deeper, maybe that's the wrong phrase, to unpack that and to think what can we learn from the spirituality of Dominic and the Dominicans, and for me to tell a few personal stories. But to keep this pretty objective, let's just learn about the life and the faith of St Dominic. Dominic was born soon after 1170 at Caleruega. Okay, impossible Spanish names here for an English person like me. Caleruega, then Calaraga in Old Castile, Spain. So, Spanish, St Dominic. His father, Felix, was a warden in the town. His mother is a saint, is a blessed. So this is a lovely bit of Catholic history. His mother, Blessed Joan of Azza. Her feast day is the 2nd of August, and Dominic's is a week later, 6 days later, on the 8th of August. It was clearly a devout family, so it's not always the case, but what a blessing when someone is brought up with a deep faith, and what a gift it is that parents can share their faith with their children when that's possible. Dominic's parents wanted him, had every hope that he would dedicate his life to the church, and he had a deep faith growing up. He was about 14 when he left the care of his uncle, the archpriest Gumiel, to enter university in Palencia, and he specialized in theology. So this wasn't typical of everyone, but here is someone you might say has had an uncomplicated religious journey, a devout family, growing up in the Christian faith, wanting to be a priest, going to study theology at university. He was hardworking, serious, enjoyed his study, and there's a little note here that unusually he owned his books. Now, books were expensive things then, so it just showed that he came from a relatively well-off family and that he cared enough about learning to actually buy the books and not just read them to get through his studies. And another note, moving on from the fact that he owned books, was there's a beautiful true story about how when he was studying as a student, there was a great famine in the town, in that area. And he sold his books, the things that, if you like, were most necessary for him. He sold them in order to help the poor and to help feed people through that famine. Others followed his example. And while he was still a student, he was clearly a very impressive young man. He was made a canon of Osma Cathedral by a wonderful bishop, a reforming bishop, Martin of Osma. And after his priestly ordination, he took up duties here in Osma, working closely with the bishop. It's hard for us to picture this because we've got this idea of diocesan priests like myself working in their parishes, but it was fairly common for priests to be attached to the cathedral as canons, living in a kind of monastic community. So, but strictly speaking, they're secular diocesan priests doing ministry in the town, in the villages around the cathedral, but living together as a community. And in fact, in this case, the chapter of canons lived together under the rule of St Augustine. So there were kind of secular priests working with the bishop, but also living religious life. The importance of community that Dominic picked up. He spent as a young priest much time in study, in public worship, in private prayer, and there's wonderful stories of Dominic's devotion to prayer. I think I've forgotten the exact title. I think it's the 9 ways of praying that Dominic has got in the tradition, and you can look up that if you want. He was the sacristan by 1199, so he's 29. By the time he hit 30, he was sub-prior. And when Diego, his friend, was made Bishop of Osma, so there'd been a great bishop, and now there was a new bishop, Diego, very close to Dominic. Dominic succeeded Diego as prior of the chapter. So here's the setting. A young priest, thoughtful, prayerful, intelligent, hardworking, just getting on with his priestly life in the Diocese of Osma in Spain. Not much more to say. But this is the lovely thing with, I was going to say with the saints, with all of us in different ways, hopefully, when the Lord steps in and things take a slightly different course. In 1203, the King of Castile sent Diego to the north of Germany, or maybe to Denmark, to negotiate a marriage for his son. This is what happened. Yes, you didn't fall in love or go on a dating site. Your rich parents negotiated alliances with other counts and dukes and kings and queens, and your marriage was arranged for you. Diego, the bishop, going on this mission for his king, took Dominic with him. 2 years later, they returned to complete the arrangements. Interesting footnote here, but the prince's future wife had decided to become a nun, so things obviously got a bit more complicated. Maybe she didn't like the marriage. But this is providence. On both occasions, to get to Germany, Denmark, they had to pass through the area of the Languedoc, Languedoc, Languedoc. Again, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing this French properly, in the southern France. So simply travelling from Spain through southern France, the area of the Languedoc, up to the north and up to Germany. But in the Languedoc, this was where the heresy of Albigensianism, or the Cathars. So the Cathar, the Albigensian heresy, as it's become known, this I'll come on to this in a minute, but this was widespread in this area of Languedoc, and especially around the city of Toulouse. Dominic became aware of just the challenges to Christian faith, the varieties of Christian faith, the unorthodoxy and the heresy of many Christians, ordinary people, priests, even bishops in these areas. They stayed in the house of a Cathar in Toulouse, and Dominic spent the night disputing with him. And apparently the next morning, this man had realized the error of his ways and came back to the true Catholic faith. But something in Dominic, I suppose, and I hope for every priest, but especially in Dominic, a longing to lead people to the true faith, to preach the truth and to share the truth of the scriptures and the truth of the teaching of the Catholic Church. Eventually, Diego and Dominic, close friends, this became not just an accident, but a feeling that God had led them to this area of the Languedoc, and that he was calling them to a special mission to help the people there. Together, Diego and Dominic went to Rome to ask Pope Innocent III's permission to preach the gospel to a group called the Cumans. These were non-Christians, probably up in Hungary. So something within them was stirring about preaching and teaching, and a longing, we'd say today, to evangelize, to go on mission. They'd seen the heresy of the Languedoc. They'd seen how many German-speaking areas had lost the Christian faith, were just completely pagan. And Diego, as a bishop, wanted to resign his role as a bishop so that he could become a preacher and an evangelizer. But the Pope Innocent III, he recognized something in them, and also he knew how much the church needed reforming and the gospel needed preaching in the West. He didn't want to give up on Christianity in his home turf, if you like. He didn't want to just send missionaries abroad. He was sympathetic, but he wanted them to stay in Western Europe instead of going into the northern and the eastern territories. At the end of May 1204, the Pope appointed 3 official pontifical legates for a new campaign of evangelization and preaching to help bring the Languedoc region back to the mainstream of Christian Catholic teaching. And he appointed Cistercian monks to do this. The authorities were often reluctant to cooperate. The local clergy were often ineffectual. The legates were doing their best, Carthusian monks travelling round with a great retinue, with a little bit of pomp and ceremony. And on their way back, Dominic and Diego visited Cathar, where the Cistercians were. They got to know the area, they got to know the area of the Languedoc, they met the legates who asked Diego for advice, and they began to understand more the needs of the church and of Christians in this area. And finally, let's come to what exactly is going on in the faith of these people, the Cathars. I'm not going into loads of detail, and I won't pretend to fully understand it myself, but Catharism began in France in the beginning of the 11th century, and it seems to have been a mix of pre-Christian and Christian elements. They appealed, the Cathars, to the New Testament, but they shunned the Old Testament. They wanted to follow the purity of New Testament teaching and preaching. So there was something really beautiful and zealous and enthusiastic. But they were in some ways too enthusiastic, extremists. Now, you can't be extreme in loving the gospel, but you can be extreme sometimes in taking some elements out of the gospel, in isolating them and forgetting the richness and the balance of the whole gospel and the whole of Catholic teaching. Catharism was, in its philosophy, its theology, a dualism. It believed not just in the good God, but in a principle, a force of evil, almost as if good and evil were like two equal, opposing, balancing powers, as if there was an ongoing struggle between good and evil. Now, of course, in one sense there is, but we know there are not two gods, a good God and an evil God. There's a loving God who has defeated evil and is helping us to come closer to him and to receive the gift of salvation. That's our mainstream Christian faith, but it can get very distorted into this idea that there's an ongoing battle between two forces and it's not resolved. And as I say, as if almost there were two gods. And there were great grades of belonging in Catharism. There was a group called the Perfect, an inner circle who were seeking a mode of perfection, a very restrained diet, complete celibacy. And ordinary Cathars didn't have to follow such an austere life, but they looked up to this group of perfect leaders. So you can see some of the attraction in this, a radical form of life, which we all need to aspire to in some ways, but it got distorted by some traditions, some bad philosophy, some intellectual muddle, and some habits and lifestyles that were taken to extremes. Diego, though, and Dominic, they were very aware that you couldn't just go in and preach if you weren't giving an example of an authentic Christian life. And it's not that the Cistercian preachers were bad men, but they were carrying with them all the baggage of a wonderful historic monastic way of life, and they were coming in as papal legates. They were brandishing their authority. They were standing on ceremony. They were expecting to be treated with deference, and they were, relative to ordinary people, living a very rich worldly lifestyle. Diego and Dominic realised that there was a thirst in ordinary people for authenticity, simplicity, and that if they were going to preach the gospel, they needed to live the gospel and walk in the footsteps of Jesus and the first apostles, and yes, even imitate the Cathars in their radical life of poverty and simplicity. So this was the turning point, realising what was needed, solid Catholic teaching, a love for the people that they were meeting and a desire to share their life and to communicate, and a lifestyle and a holiness about their way of life, which would impress and move and be an example to those around them. It was also a big, wonderful part of the Cathars to involve women in their witness and their ministry. In those days, it was a radical proposal because of the nature of society then. So Diego and Dominic realised that the part of what they needed was a female as well as a male component in their mission and in their prayer. And they gathered together some convert nuns, some nuns from the centre of the Cathar movement who were converted by their preaching but wanted to live their radical lifestyle, a life of poverty and community and prayer, but to live that now as Catholic sisters. So it wasn't strictly yet the first Dominican nuns, because this was a slightly random beginning, and it involved Diego as much as Dominic. But you see at the beginnings of this preaching and this Dominican movement an involvement of women in the monastic life, the commitment to prayer and contemplation to support and complement the work of the preachers and the priests. So the work is beginning in earnest now. There was a 2-week debate between the Cathars and Bishop Diego in 2007, and Dominic provided some of the writings, the written depositions. It was effective. There were converts from Catharism to mainstream Catholicism. There were new Cistercian priests and monks arriving to support Dominic and Diego in their mission. There was a great movement from the Pope and from the local authorities as well to try and crush this heresy with more secular means, if you like, using the forces of authorities, of the state, of the government. Dominic is presented here in all the records and all the depositions about him as a man of unusual integrity, when it was an age that seemed to be so brutal and intolerant. He was horrified by heresy because he had such a love for the truth, and he believed in the fullness of revelation, and he longed to share that with people. He believed that heretics needed to be shown the truth and saved, and that a good argument was able to win souls and convert minds and hearts. Maybe you don't believe that, but just this was Dominic's simple, old-fashioned understanding of truth and preaching. But he was against, it seems, using violence for the sake of conversion. So many stories about heretics being persecuted by the secular authorities, forced conversions, executions of those who refused to renounce their faith. Dominic, as far as we can see, was against this use of violence. He's said, to have rebuked one of his supporters, Bishop Fulk, Bishop of Toulouse, when the bishop went on a visitation with soldiers and servants and supply mules. Dominic said to this bishop, who he'd been close to, "You cannot defeat the enemies of the faith like that. Arm yourself with prayer, not a sword. Wear humility, not fine clothes." This is Dominic's instinct. You need humility, simplicity, and poverty, and not pomp and riches. You need prayer, not violence. You need truth. We understand that Dominic followed Diego's example, to have preached tactfully, to have travelled, eaten, slept and prayed so with such simplicity and poverty of spirit and of mind and of heart, that the Cathars were ready to hear his message. In other words, his life preached the gospel even before he met people. His way of life went ahead of him. He didn't believe in using military force. He thought it was ineffective, if nothing else. There were a number of different converts. Dominic was a successful preacher in that sense, and he was recognised as such. 3 times Dominic was invited to become a bishop. He always refused. He spent basically 10 years preaching in the area of the Languedoc as a leader, without a particular mandate from the Pope, just working locally, working with the support of his bishop, with a small group of preachers, beginning his religious instruction, often starting with the nobles and the people high up in society, but able to preach to everyone, living his example of a simple life. And eventually began to form a way of life that would become the beginnings of the Dominican order. Men committed to preaching, to orthodoxy, to union with the Catholic Church, to a simplicity of life, to poverty, to a deep community, and to the importance of learning and of study. And in collaboration with a group of women committed to the same ideals, and in the circumstances of the times, that meant to be in an enclosed monastic life, but in later centuries, for the women as much as the men to share in the preaching and the community life and the missionary work in so many different wonderful ways. He wore the habit of an Augustinian canon and followed that rule because those were his roots. But it became clearer and clearer that he needed to form a body of men who would come together with a focus on studies and preaching and pastoral work and poverty and community life. The Bishop of Toulouse, Bishop Fulk, wanted him to found a permanent institute of preachers in the diocese, but it became clear that what was needed was something bigger than just a diocesan movement. The Fourth Lateran Council, one of the great councils of the Church, began in November 1215, so when Dominic was 45 and just as all his ideas were coming to fruition. One of the council's emphasis was on heresy and the importance of good preaching. Eventually, there was a sense of bringing together the rule. So it was a little bit haphazard at the beginning. It was bringing together the traditions that Dominic had been living and trying to form the beginnings of a religious order and a rule of life and the constitutions. But eventually, the foundations of the Dominican order were laid, the order of preachers. Approval was given for an appropriate rule for a new religious order. The brothers met at Prouille. Again, how do I pronounce that? Prouille, Prouille, sometime in 1216, and they decided to use the rule of St Augustine as the foundation for their order. Dominic added some constitutions, some borrowings from the Cistercians, and also from the Premonstratensians, the Norbertine order. And eventually they found a church that would be a base for them. Dominic was prior and master, and he was freed from his duties as a canon back in Spain in Osma. This is therefore the first Dominican community beginning its common life under vows in the church of Saint Romain in Toulouse. Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, died in 1216. Dominic left for Rome to gain approval for his order, and eventually he was given that by the next pope, Pope Honorius III. So here we are, Dominic's life, his preaching, his convictions, which are brought together into the Dominican order. And finally, just a little bit of history and reflection on how that grew leading up to the end of Dominic's life. On the 15th of August, 1217, the Friars Preachers, the Order of Preachers, this is why the Dominicans are called OP, the Order of Preachers. They met together, and immediately Dominic's instinct and desire was not to keep the community together. It was to send the brothers out on mission and out to deepen their faith and their learning. Very, very instructive. Yeah. Maybe you can take this as a model for things in your own life. When we begin something, we want to protect it, don't we? Make sure it's all going fine. Dominic's instinct was not to protect it, but to get it moving and to take the risk of sending people out, even though it was very new. Friars were sent in many different directions. 4 friars were dispatched to Spain, 7 to Paris, and a centre was set up in Toulouse. They were using the centre at Toulouse as a base, but the reason that they were sent to Paris was in case the situation at Toulouse became unstable and they needed a base in other places. So Dominic wanted to send people out in order to learn in other centres of learning, and also to protect the order so that they were in different places and they could regroup in different places. Brothers were sent eventually to Bologna, so into Italy. And Paris and Bologna would be key bases for the order's development. And Dominic himself, his shrine, his body is in Bologna, and his shrine is in the main house in Bologna there. Very soon there were houses in Verona, Piacenza, in Brescia. Very soon the order was expanding beyond France and Spain and Italy. There were 3 Scandinavian students. There was a Hungarian teacher converted, and it rekindled Dominic's desire to take the gospel outside of the Christian lands into places that hadn't heard the Christian gospel before. Dominic wanted the nuns now to be put on a better order, a better footing. So eventually he managed to get constitutions established for the nuns and to get them approved and to set up different monasteries of Dominican nuns. With this newly established order now growing and expanding, a male and a female branch, Pope Honorius in 1220 made Dominic the Master General. The final constitution was drawn up. The order's commitment to poverty and to begging was established. A special and quite a unique flexibility was given to the Dominicans in their constitutions to dispense the friars from any observances and traditions that might get in the way of the focus of their life, which was preaching, scholarship, conversion, and pastoral work. So it was to say, this religious order is not just to exist for its own sake, for the sake of living a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These friars, their constitutions were for the sake of the mission of study and of preaching and of pastoral work. And if things got in the way, then they needed to be changed or dispensed. The order exists for the mission, not the mission existing for the order. This is the tag, which we've heard many times in recent years: mission, not maintenance. And this was very much part of the Dominican spirit. Dominic preached whenever he travelled and stressed the ministry of the word above all others, but friars were to prepare for their preaching with prayer, humility, and self-denial. And obedience was central in the life of every monk and friar and every religious order, but especially in the Dominican order, because they were meant to support one another in their work and to be so focused on their mission. Their houses, therefore, were meant to be centres of community and learning, but then of mission and pastoral work. Two wonderful Dominican phrases. One is to hand on to others the fruits of contemplation. To hand on to others the fruits of one's study or contemplation, so that study and prayer and contemplation were meant to lead to personal encounter. And another lovely phrase of St Dominic's, whoever governs the passions is master of the world. We must either rule them or be ruled by them. It is better to be the hammer than the anvil. So he was teaching his missionaries to address the heart as well as the mind, to address the lifestyle as well as the life of learning. So study, biblical studies, study of theology, teaching, rather than manual labour, and then the begging and the simplicity of life, and then the preaching and the missionary work. The order grew and grew. Dominic grew and aged and kept preaching for as long as he could. He became sick one day. He made a general confession. He said, as he was dying, "My dear sons, these are my bequests. Practice charity in common. Remain humble. Stay poor willingly." Isn't it interesting? Didn't say study, preach. He said, practice charity in common. Remain humble. Stay poor willingly. He was 52 when he died on the evening of the 6th of August, 1221. He told the friars round his bed that he would be more useful after his death than living, asked them to pray for him, and died in poverty. Blessed Jordan of Saxony wrote in Dominic's lifetime, quote, "Nothing disturbed his equanimity except a lively sympathy with any suffering. A person's face shows whether he or she is really happy. Dominic's was friendly and joyful. You could easily see his inner peace." Final dates. So he died in 1221. His body was taken to a new church in 1233, and he was canonized in 1234, very soon, just 13 years after his death. And I'm reading from Butler's Lives of the Saints, so I don't know the up-to-date figures. This is about 20 years old, this book now, isn't it? But when this book was written, it says, "The best monument to Dominic is the work today of," quote, 6,600 friars in 51 provinces, 38,000 contemplative and apostolic nuns in 150 congregations, 4,400 enclosed nuns in 250 monasteries, and 70,000 lay members in 70 fraternities. His order has produced countless superlative preachers, missionaries, administrators, scholars, saints, and restless spirits with something of Dominic's relentless determination. Praise the Lord for the life of St Dominic. Look, I've gone through his life in a very matter-of-fact way, lots of dates and lists and facts. It's good to know the outlines of someone's story, and it's good to understand the lives of the saints more and more. But when I speak next time, and I'll put a link in the video, I want to speak about Dominican spirituality and speak a little bit more about the stories of his life, how they affect us, and some of the wonderful ways that God has blessed me through the Dominicans, and what I've learnt about Dominic and his spirituality, and how that might be able to help you in your own faith. Very nice to be with you. God bless you, and see you next time.